Good afternoon and welcome to Osprey International Science Festival 2022 in this Scotland's Year of Stories. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be hosting this Ian S. Scott Lecture in association with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Our speaker today is Professor Roger Crofts. Roger has spent his career within the public sector as a research worker, as a government advisor and administrator, and as the leader of a major public body. He's now an environmental strategy and policy advisor, charity volunteer, writer and speaker working in Scotland, Iceland and around Europe. Roger, as a geographer, looks at the land and landscape in full view, and he sees what is good and what is awful. And as the founder, CEO of Scottish National Heritage, he focuses on what needs to be done by government and owners to right the wrongs of the past to create a better future. His recreational interests are cooking without a recipe book, restructuring gardens, singing in private, walking in the hills, photographing wildflowers, and helping people to understand the Earth's heritage and environment. Now, his talk today, inspired by us being told more trees are needed in the Highlands and Islands to combat climate change, suggests this needs careful thought about siting decisions to avoid past problems. Now, Roger's going to give his presentation, and we're going to give the audience, yourselves, a chance to ask questions and answers. And Maha here in the front will have the roving microphone. So please have one question on that side and one question on that side. We'll keep Maha fully exercised just enjoy that. So that's enough from me, Roger. It's all over to you now.
It may seem a little funny talking about trees in Orkney because the climate's a bit against them. But trees are very important. But what do you feel about them? I've deliberately put on the opening slide there the great Scots pines, the great wood of Caledon as it's called, wonderful native tree, or some of the less well celebrated trees like hazel and alder that we perhaps forget about, but they're in abundance. But on the other side, quite deliberately, maybe slightly more provocatively, two non-native species. The beech, but people are hugging it. That's the historiographer royal, T.C. Smaug, hugging it. And maybe we've got used to that one. But have we got used to the others? The Sitka spruce. And they are going to figure in my talk. But let's not start off on the negative. Let's be positive and think about the beauty of trees. And I want to just illustrate that by going to a few places in the world that I've been fortunate enough to visit. So the great gum trees in Australia, here in Wilson's Promontory National Park in Victoria, a fabulous ecosystem. And I show that one quite deliberately because later on I'll show you where it's being misused in another part of the world. Or, of course, our own great oak trees. We tend to think of oak trees as the English oak. Well, that's a total and utter misnomer because Scotland has the most magnificent oaks. The one here on the left is the Burnham oak, but we also have oaks at Dalkeith and also the Cadzow oaks. They're all in private ownership, but they are there for many hundreds of years, and they're still giving a mast of acorns, so they're still growing. Or we have our own rainforest. You knew that, didn't you? We have the West Coast rainforest. It's oaks, but it's a whole lot of other species up the West Coast. from Scowrie really all the way down to Kintyre. It's not in a wonderful state of health at the moment, but it's magnificent because of that damp climate. So its equivalents are similar forests in the northwest Pacific region of the USA and Canada, for example. So remember, we've got our own rainforest. It's not just a tropical phenomenon. But in other parts of Europe, there are wonderful forests. I love this one in Poland. This is the Polish side of the border with Belarus, the Beavezia forest. It's a World Heritage Site. And it's the linden tree. You know that's the lime, of course, don't you? We have lots of limes, many of them planted. They're much more a native species further south, and certainly across Europe. And here you see it in its magnificent with native bison grazing in those forests, just as you would expect them to. Or further south in Europe, the great beech woods. You see them a lot in the North German plain, but also in many of the mid-European states, to the extent now that the accumulation of these woodlands is now a World Heritage Site, or a series of sites making up this fantastic forest. If you go to the Atlantic Islands, for instance, in the west side of the Canary Islands, or if you go to Madeira, you'll see a whole other rainforest, and it's really quite magnificent. They call it Old Man's Beard. I shaved mine off because I thought it was horrid. But there's this wonderful ecosystem there. It's not just the trees, it's all the mosses and the bryophytes and the ground shrubs and the middle level shrubs. And I can tell you, heathers that you've never seen the like of, because they're up to 10 feet high in these places, in their natural landscape. And we have, of course, what some people sadly call the forester's weed, the birch. I don't know about you, I think the birch, in particular the drooping birch petula pendula, is the most magnificent tree. And this is a photograph of it marching across the Muir of Dinnet in Aberdeenshire. It's been quite controversial because it's been covering over some special late glacial landforms. But it is a very fine tree, and we have it as part of our native tree flora. And ladies and gentlemen, even the Sitka spruce is a major and wonderful tree in its natural environment. I had the great fortune to be in the Olympic National Park in Washington State, USA, many years ago. We spent a day seeing the whole succession, these wonderful trees of 800 years old falling over, and then the seed rain from the next trees just scattering along the tree trunks. And at one stage, we saw this line of trees like this with, standing on their roots, and we realized that, of course, the trunks, which had been the mother, had disintegrated. And it was a beautiful succession, and there it was in its native state. So the Sitka's is not a bad tree, but right place. We'll come back to that. But of course, I've talked entirely about native trees at the moment. What about those that have been introduced or earlier? The agricultural improvers, of course. Grant of Monny Musk in Aberdeenshire, for instance, brought in the beeches. The northern limit, naturally, is in the Chilterns in Buckinghamshire. But they do create very fine avenues of beech hedges, and often a wonderful understory in the spring of Hyacinthus non-scripta, the native bluebell, the English bluebell, not our special Scottish one, of course. And another tree that is a non-native that we've really got used to is the sycamore. My gosh, you've got a lot of them in Orkney, and no wonder why. It is very resilient to the sort of situations of weather that you have here. But it creates a whole habitat itself. It's not just a lump of wood. It creates niches for all sorts of species of plants and animals. And I think we got used to that quite. One of my august predecessors in nature conservation in Scotland had a conversion, and he wrote a paper because he was so against the sycamore. That's John Morton Boyd, who some of you might have heard of, and wrote a paper because he suddenly looked at it and realised what a wonderful habitat it was. But we have caused a lot of problems, and what are they? And I want to dwell on that in the next part of this talk before I come on to say, well, what are we going to do about it? What should be done about it? I've always got to end on positive. There's no point in sackcloth and ashes approach to the environment. It doesn't work. But you know, there's a bit of confusion about the terminology. What are we talking about here? What's a native or a non-native? The conservation ecologists have actually been quite clever, and it's not just native and non-native, because some non-native trees have been here for so long that you know, they're all almost like me as an Englishman living in Scotland for well more than half my life. You know, well, I think I'm fairly accepted. I'm looking at my friends there, just don't say the wrong thing. So there are gradations there. But you know, there is quite a polarity in the debate between the native species and the non-natives. And then there's also a lot of, I would call it greenwash. Are we talking about forests or are we talking about woodlands? Very interesting. The government in Scotland's language has changed. They used to talk about forests, and that became, should we say, a dirty word, so they now talk about woodlands, but they're talking about single species monocultures of non-native trees. So we've got to get that terminology. And we have to remind ourselves, what are the native trees of Scotland? And this map gives you a fairly crude assessment of what they are. The birch, the pine, the oak, the hazel, the lime, the ash, and the alder. So a wide variety of species. As you can see from the map, not all of them will grow everywhere in Scotland, because you know, Scotland itself, I always call it the most naturally diverse small country in the world because of its varied rock types and the soils which emanate from that and the glacial period. And its position in the northeast Atlantic, and therefore that mid-latitude maritime climate. So we've got all of these as our native species to think about when we are saying more trees, please. And we too often forget about that. Of course, they have changed over time. This is just a simple pollen diagram from a site in Fife, Blacklock. And you'll see on the left-hand side there the growth and decline of various species, the very obvious ones, the alder decline, and then the hazel decline, and then the growth of the birch. But the most significant thing in terms of human intervention is so blindingly obvious here, and that is the growth of grasses and sedges. In other words, we came along and we said, God, we don't want all these trees, we want to cultivate the ground. And so we've spent the best part of, I think, 5 millennia in Scotland removing the native trees. But there were those far-sighted people. And this guy here, Sir John Sterling Maxwell, here in Pollock House in Glasgow, for those of you who come from that part of the country, he was a revered gentleman. But he also owned the Ossian estate in the Central Highlands. And he decided to experiment with a whole lot of different tree species. And his conclusion, after the plantations around Loch Ossian, which you can see on the map there, was, of all the trees we have tried, Sitka spruce promises the best return. And that was in 1929. And some people would add to that, well, that was the beginning of the decline, or the rot set in, because he went on to say, because he didn't understand the ground he was planting them in, that the peat was a menace there, and we want to get rid of the peat, it's worthless. my gosh, how times change, because we're now saying exactly the opposite. This is what Loch Ossian looked like just over 20 years ago when I was last there. There's still a lot of non-native species, but I know that landowner is very keen to renaturalise the estate, rewild it, or whatever is the popular term. But that takes time. So what we have to remember, and this is what I'm going to say is very unpopular with the Confederation of Forestry and with the forestry industry. Sitka spruce is an invasive non-native species. We talk about non-native species like Himalayan balsam, Japanese knotweed, and those things, but we have to remember that we are using public money, taxpayers' money, to plant these species, and they invade, as you can see in these two photographs. And that was really brought home to us on our way here. We went into the flow country of Caithness and Sutherland and saw the spread of Sitka spruce, which is not where it had been planted at all. Another example, and it's a tree species we have used some in Scotland, the lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta. You'll see there the native area is very much like the Sitka spruce in northwest North America. But you see how much it's spread. And the point I want to make is that this is a huge argument now going on in Iceland, to the extent that the Minister for Agriculture and Forestry has just issued the other day a consultation paper saying this has got to stop. We're not having any more of these non-native species. We know how to do it with our native species of birch and willow particularly, and to a lesser extent aspen. But you can see the spread there, and this map tells it all. The dark area is the original plantation, but look at the spread over the decade from 2010 to 2020. And this is extremely controversial, and it's actually going to lead to the demise of the Icelandic Forestry Service, and it's collapsing into a much more innovative and forward-looking soil conservation service, which knows how to use native species. So we're not alone in having these sorts of debates, and it's a really red-hot one, if that's the right word to say, in Iceland, where they've just had an eruption. But sadly, there are a lot of examples around the world where non-native species are being used. So contrast the scene on the photograph here in the Algarve of southern Portugal with what I showed you in the promontory, Wilson's promontory in Victoria earlier in this talk. These are totally out of place, and the eucalyptus is well known ecologically for taking all the water out of the ground and creating drought conditions in the surrounding area. So what's its benefit? Of course, it's also a high resin count, so a high fire risk, which of course, as you will know from reading the media over the recent years, we have much greater fire risk from these places. So what are we doing about it in Scotland? Well, we have a forest strategy. Scottish Government, and I say this as a former civil servant, is very good at writing strategies, using all the right sort of language. Some of it I don't really understand anymore because it has to be just correct and tickety-boo, fit all the boxes. And the forestry strategy is like that, and they have an implementation plan. But what do they do on the ground? They have a forestry grant scheme which has been running from 2014 to the present year, over £250 million of money, most of it for forest and woodland creation, and the greatest proportion of that for commercial conifer afforestation. The scheme's far too complicated for most people, except the professional forest industry, to understand. It's wrongly directed because it ignores the management of existing forests and particularly existing woodlands, like our wonderful native Scots pine forests and like our Atlantic rainforest that I mentioned earlier as examples. And it's an insufficient focus on species diversity. And what the ecologists tell us is the more single species you have, the greater the chances of disease spreading through those. So to me, the rhetoric's good, but the reality is appalling on the ground. I'm deliberately being provocative by showing you a photograph taken from a helicopter trip I did over the Flow country, Caithness, in 1989. But the damage there was done because of people who thought they could drain the peatlands, which sometimes were 10, 20 meters depth. They could use non-native species like lodgepole and sitka. And there were tax breaks to help to persuade people to do it. Arguably, we've got a tax break in a different way through the Forest Grant Scheme now. And the consequence of that is really problematic. All the different forestry operations, planting, thinning, clear felling, use of heavy machinery, grazing and browsing, create problems. They create problems in the water column, they create problems in the soil, and they create problems for nature. See all those negative words in there? These are not my words, these are from the European Environment Agency, who's well known for its accuracy of environmental objective analysis and reporting. Wildlife disturbance, compaction, erosion, sedimentation, eutrophication. And you get these things. A guy sat in a tractor on beautifully vegetated ground in a hill area not far from Edinburgh, and he drove the tractor down the hill with the plough, and he turned the sward over. He went so deep he hit the substrate. The nutrients are all flushed out into the rivers, so if there are breeding fish in those rivers, of course the gravel beds are just wrecked. But of course, if you turn the soil over, you give off carbon as well. Oh, but wait a minute. The trees they're planting are Sitka spruce, and they're there to capture carbon, because that's the new holy grail. There's something of a confusion there. This is taxpayer funded. Look at it. This is the new solution to help capture carbon to aid our work on climate change. So we have this groundbreaking act, the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, and yet government is still allowing this to happen with no enforcement. So they decide to change the method. We won't use the plough, so we'll use what is called mounding. You see all these mounds? I'll show you a slightly better one. This is all done by machinery. So it's not having quite as bad effect, but it's still having a bad effect because, of course, it's turning the soil over and it's giving off carbon, and it's breaking up what was a biodiverse flora on the ground. Oh, but we're planting Sitka spruce in there. Isn't that a good thing? And we're also still seeing the felling and removal not just of trees, but of shrubs. This photograph was taken in Angus in January or February of this year. What is the justification for this? These are friable sandy soils, so they're very prone to wind erosion, and we know that because often roads are blocked in Angus and Kincardineshire in the winter. They have to get the bulldozers out to take the soil away, but they can't reuse it again because it's, dare I say, knackered. And this is still being allowed in a country that is saying we know how to deal with climate change in the way that we manage the land. And the results, you may like this sort of photo. This is in a national park, Blocham and Crofts National Park. Nothing's changed there whatsoever since the national park was designated. You see, and it's mainly foreign species. There are larches and different, the Norway spruce and Sitka spruce and others. There's some native species along the river at Moss. This is near Loch Lubnaig. And this is what happens when you start to fell. You talk about a devastated landscape. You know, it's horrid. We see these terrible photographs of of the trenches in World War I, but they're doing just this same damage in an unthinking way. They're leaving a few trees there, because that's good for the birds, we're told. Pretty unnatural, isn't it? And we're still surrounding bogs. This is a photograph of the Silver Flow National Nature Reserve in the Galloway Hills. But it's totally wrecked because the degree of acidification that's captured from the atmosphere into those trees and into the water of the bog is just so unnatural, and it's totally undermining that bog. But I had a day once with a senior member of the Forestry Commission who said, "It's all right, Roger, it will be better on the second rotation." In other words, when they fell, we'll have learnt lessons and we will do a much more, if you like, a gardening approach. Well, that's the second rotation. Can you see the small things there? Does it look any different? Does it look any better? Not at all. They're not learning whatsoever. And you'll see in places where the open moorland has been totally lost, so the wide-ranging birds, eagles, hen harriers, and the like, have vanished entirely. The leks for the blackcocks have all disappeared. This is particularly in Galloway. We've got all of this documented, and the landscape has been transformed into something like this. To the extent that the Galloway Fisheries Trust biologists are really first-class freshwater biologists. And I'm sure one of my old pals in the audience will know them well and agree with what I'm saying. Forested areas exacerbate the process of acidification, as coniferous trees are particularly efficient at scavenging pollutants. And when peatlands are heavily drained for tree planting, then acidifying pollutants are released into the surrounding watercourses. Wow, that's a pretty damning indictment, isn't it? Well, then we've got another problem, which is of our own making. We've got too many herbivores that like eating young trees. They love them, actually. We've got probably about 1 million deer in Scotland of the various species. We've been trying to remove them for years and years and years, but the numbers keep going up. So it's a total failure of the use of legislation that exists, because a fearedness on the part of government to actually challenge the large estates to do what they should be doing in terms of long-term stewardship. And so trees don't grow. And a recent assessment I was been involved with in Galloway and Southern Ayrshire, when we were doing a 10-year review of the biosphere reserve there, the first one of the new generation in Scotland. And they concluded that 85% of all new woodland in the biosphere is coniferous. Its overall impact is to skew the composition and management of the woodland within the biosphere towards a monoculture. Oh dear. And at the same time, because we're using, as I mentioned on Patson earlier, single species too often, we're misunderstanding the disease vectors that are around now. And the advice from the experts in the forestry world seems to change from, we must cut all those trees down, burn them, or no, we'll leave them in the ground. And for any manager, that is really confusing. We've got to accept, though, with climate change, that there are going to be many more of these diseases. And if we continue to plant monocultures, we're not going to get anywhere. And when it comes to thinning and harvesting, we're using very heavy machinery. You know, it's a bit of a con, wide deal, but look at the damage to the soil from those machines. And of course, we are using heavy machinery to make roads into the forests that are suitable for road vehicles, because that's the way that the industry is structured. Water and soil washes off the hill. More to the point, we have to then take the timber to all of these processing plants around the country, the sawmills and the paper mills. Yes, we have better ways of doing it on the islands, using barges, but nevertheless we're using huge articulated lorries. And in many settlements, this scene is the order, not just of the day, of the hour quite often. Huge timber trucks, driven by piece rate paid drivers, so they're in a hurry. They take them into the forest, so of course the tracks need to be suitable for trucks like this, and then they drive them across the country. And we now have what are now called strategic timber routes, and if you drive along some of these, you would be terrified to driving if the timber truck comes in the opposite direction, because they're not going to wait. And sometimes they cab over, of course, and you get that sort of scene. And so I was out with some friends earlier this year, and I just shook my head and thought, did I see nature today? Because that's what was the question we were asking as I looked at Sitka spruce monoculture striding over the hills. Okay, more trees, yes. There's an old adage, right trees in the right place at the right time. I think we need to throw that out because it's one that's now so in the mentality of foresters opposed to ecologists, people who understand the environment. So, where, what, and how? Where? Well, we produced advice way back in 1989. I remember signing a circular to local authorities to produce indicative forestry strategies. Where do you think the best place for forestry was compared with maintaining the landscape, maintaining upland agriculture, making sure we protected the key nature areas? That lasted for 30 years, that. Unfortunately, most of the authorities didn't do the strategies because there was the old adage, well, the new adage in the Scottish government, let market forces rule, just as they have done with wind turbines. So we've got a chaotic situation where the industry decides where it wants to go. And what we have, therefore, is a classic mismatch. The map on the left there, if you look at the grey areas, this is the land unsuitable for forestry. Look at the right-hand one and look at the green area. Is there not... it's telling you a story that we've ignored that advice that came from the forerunner of the James Hutton Institute. So, what should we be doing? Well, we have now an approach coming out of the 2009 Climate Change Scotland Act called land use strategies, and now they're being regionalised, and there's a really important approach being adopted so that people in the Orkney Islands, in Galloway and other parts of Scotland can actually sit down and work out where do we want the trees and how does that going to relate to the maintenance of agriculture, to the protection of biodiversity, the protection of landscapes. Second, we need to think about, well, can the land take this? Is it a good thing in the context of improving the environment rather than damaging it? So I just showed two pictures there. One is we should not be planting trees on the soils with the highest carbon stocks. Because after all, remember, we're trying to lock carbon in the soil, not give it out when we dig it up. And we should also not be planting trees and the black and the red and the yellow spots on the map, because they're the areas with the lowest carrying capacity in terms of water acidification. But we should also be thinking about adoption of international ideas, which were first discovered in Amazonia, but then also in the Deccan of India, about if you cut the forest down, the land downstream in what we call the water cycle, suddenly it becomes drought prone, and therefore the agriculture disappears. And there were wonderful examples. So what we should be thinking of adopting that same approach, because we have drought-prone areas in Scotland, of course, If you look at the summer temperature map, you see the red and the winter, the red in summer and winter is especially on the east coast and the south. And if you see where there is a rainfall deficit on the right-hand maps, particularly in the summer, you'll see it's down the east coast. So shouldn't we be planting trees upwind, up water stream, to be able to provide a source of water over a period of time? We're not talking about instant result here. What we are talking about is something that's much longer term. We haven't even thought about that in Scotland. It should be part of our strategic planning, maybe at a regional level. And what about right trees? Well, we need to be clear what we actually want to do there. Is there a clear purpose? I have deliberately put here a photograph of Scots pine, native Scots pine, planted in the Colburn forest, because there was a clear purpose to stabilise these huge moving sand dunes, which were overwhelming farmland, which were overwhelming settlements. And it's worked, but it's better than worked because it's actually not just stabilised the ground. You can see the understory there. That's exactly what you would find in a stable sand dune environment. The trouble is that whilst we've got a lot of science, it's not really informing what's happening on the ground, what the forestry companies and the owners are doing. We know that older trees are better. The longer you keep the trees in the ground, the more they collect carbon. So if we're taking a quick cash crop, which is the mentality of the commercial forestry, we're not capturing as much carbon as if we left them for much, much longer. We need to think about, well, how do we make sure that we've got a gain for biodiversity? Because the Scottish statistics on our plants and animals are all in a negative trend, and even the government recent consultation has shown that. We need to build in what we know scientifically about disease resistance, and of course avoid carbon-rich soils. And the right time? Well, we're now back to planting targets, which didn't work in the 80s, and we now got to plant 15,000 hectares of trees a year. And the easiest way to do that is to get the plough out, plough down the hill, and bang in the Sitka spruce with mechanical means. Well, that's not going to work. It shouldn't be allowed to work, let me put it that way, because it means that there's much less attention to management. So what are we going to do about it? I've got just 7 quick points that I hope that you might relate to. The first is we need to work with nature. Follow the basic ecological principles. We know a lot about soils, and particularly the soil-plant association, particularly through the mycorrhiza. And we need to think about that, and we need to think ahead to grow forests. This is from a school textbook, for goodness sake, quite deliberately, geography school textbook, of course. So we're not thinking about how we're developing our forests of the future. Related to that, we need to train everybody in the forestry and woodland industry to understand these basic ecological and environmental principles. So we want to say to UHI, who do courses in this, we want to say to the Scottish Rural College, for goodness sake, you need to train employees, and we need to say to the Confederation of Forestry, you need to make sure that your employees are certified. You brag about certifying the quality of the wood from sustainable sources, but are you certifying in the most positive educational way your staff? We also need to make sure we've got an adequate supply of the right species for the right places. It's dead easy to grow trees in nurseries. This is a small scale. It's Kinloch Yew, which we had in Scottish Natural Heritage for our replanting programs on the Benay National Nature Reserve. And there are lots of others, alba trees in East Lothian, for example. So that's an important thing, that we need to think forward about the species we need and make sure that we have them. Because otherwise people will say, oh well, there's not the species we want. And we need, and I think this is the most fundamental of my hows, is learn from past mistakes, admit them, and improve management. This is just a simple example from La Gomera, one of the western isles in the Canary Islands, where they had planted pine. They thought, well, this is entirely wrong. These are not the native species. They cut them down, and the result is these beautiful trees and woodland ecosystems. So they've rebuilt that for the longer term. We know we can restructure the old commercial forests, and Forest and Land Scotland, which is the executive agency that looks after the state forests, it has got plans for that in many places. This is an example in Glendall, in one of the Angus Glens. And you see the shrinkage in the blue as you go through from 2015 to 2040, 2060, as they more naturalise that environment. It can be done, and even the state-employed foresters, they love doing this actually. And we need to restructure landscapes, particularly in the national parks, if we really want to prove that we're thinking in the long term, so that we are stewards, that is, generation after generation. And we need to make a much greater effort to control grazing, reducing sheep. Well, quite a lot of sheep have gone off the hill. You know, and if we all stop eating lamb, that would be brilliant, wouldn't it? Well, actually, I have to admit, I'm not stopping eating lamb, and nor my family, else they will kill me if I don't provide lamb for them. But, you know, we've got, you know, the nutritionists, the animal nutritionists have got pretty good answers to those sort of things that reduce the flatulence, etc. But we do need to reduce the deer. We had a deer report, the government sitting upon it. I don't think they know what to do with it, actually. It was a terrible report anyway. Because sadly, a colleague of ours who was leading it died, and it's a very legalistic approach. Otherwise, we have what you see in these two photographs of trees just in ravines and gullies, because they can't escape out of there because the herbivores are eating them away. And we've got to get rid of fences, you know, otherwise we'll have fences all around the country. They not only look ugly, low-flying slow birds like cape fly into them and get killed. And it's a problem. This is on the Balmoral estate, and it's quite difficult to get them to change their mind. But ironically, on the estate where these two photographs, the Glenfeshie estate, owned by a billionaire Danish couple, the Paulsons, they just shoot every deer that comes over the marsh line. And you can see the difference between the left-hand picture there, which was 1969 and 2017. It's become natural. The things that we know are seeds in the soil have come to life. The pines, the birch, the two sorts of juniper, for example, it's just magnificent. And it absolutely gobsmacked a whole group of us who argue about everything to do with the land and the environment. We were just overwhelmed by what has happened there because of controlled grazing. And we've got to admit the gross errors of the past and radically change our approach. We cannot allow this sort of thing, but we still are. A huge amount of work's being done in the flow country. There's a contrast between October 2016 and February 2018. You may say, oh, that's horrendous. But that we know full well that that deforested area will re-wet. The peat will begin to grow slowly over time. It will begin to sequester carbon, and it will become more natural. The fifth thing on the how is we need to build a vision for the future. The forestry strategy does have a vision. The new biodiversity strategy consultation has a vision, but we actually got to make it reality on the ground. And one example I always use is the conifer and wildwood down in the Borders. Borders Forest Trust have done a transformative job. It is best shown in these two pictures of a, if you like, a before and an in between, and it will just get better and better. They've given nature a helping hand. They've planted a lot of new trees. Well, fine, because sometimes the seed source is not there. And we also need to develop shared visions with communities, with us, as opposed to these being top down from foresters, from landowners. And there are wonderful ideas all around the country. I mean, I've just got a couple of examples here down in Galloway, which I happen to know very well, where you've got the school involved or you've got a community involved. And that community ownership and management, providing they are adequately build their capacity to do it, is superb. Because what we're seeing otherwise is large insurance companies, large companies buying up land, grabbing the public sector money for planting commercial forests. And if that's not a form of greenwashing, I don't know what is, ladies and gentlemen. And lastly, we need to get the government to change its mind. So that government funding has to be focused on what we call public benefit, not private gain. It has to have a formal contractual relationship between the grantee and the government. It needs to have proper enforcement of agreements. And if people have done wrong, then they need to pay back the money and not get another grant in future. We need to be much more draconian about these things. You may not like that idea, but this is public money and people should act responsibly. So that's the humdrum views of a retired environmental bureaucrat. But let's not forget that trees are a vital source of life for every creature on earth. There you go. They manage the water cycle, create rain and produce water vapor, store water for human use, help in flood prevention, store carbon and other nutrients. Are home to many dependent species, are the homes and provide the livelihoods for many human communities, and they're wonderful places to visit and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That was a most thought-provoking talk, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions arising from that. Maha will be wandering about the mic, so please put your hand up and she'll seek you out and give you the mic. The thought-provoking actually provoked thoughts in me, and it was the way things are going, right, the increase in wood burning stoves, biomass boilers, burners. How do you see the rapid rise in both domestic and industrial scale, use of these within the context of your talk, Roger?
I don't think we've thought that through whatsoever, to be honest. We say that, it's better to burn wood than it is to burn coal. True. It's better to burn wood than gas. Debatable, perhaps. And my answer is, well, actually what we should be doing is using more electricity produced from renewable resources. Now, I'm about to say that in Orkney, when I see certain people in the audience, but I mean, I think that is true. We seem to have these, the next silver bullet, we're better, the house is not good, so we don't bother to insulate it. The government grant schemes disappear. And it's not that expensive to buy, a big pile of logs and to burn them, because they're otherwise a waste. But we haven't thought through. I haven't seen in the public realm, if you like, what I might call the carbon accounting of the different of different fuels. Yes, we have for obviously different types of coal. Different sorts of other hydrocarbons that we extract from under the sea, for instance. But we haven't factored in the wood use one at all.
Professor, can you tell me which types or species of trees capture most carbon per year or over the lifetime of that tree?
I smile because there seems to not be a settled view amongst those that know far better, more about this than I do. So what the conclusion is coming out is that deciduous trees are better in the longer term. But then you have to say, but wait a minute, we aren't growing the coniferous trees in the longer term. We're taking them out very early. So I think it's still an open question, to be perfectly honest, except the mentality of the tree planters is, of course, that you plant the deciduous and they are there for a long, long time, as opposed to taking the quick-growing conifers out, say, mostly by year 40, if not before. It's one of these areas, where I think it's fair to say this in a science fair, that sometimes there's not a good enough dialogue between pundits like me and the scientific community to say, well, we reckon these might be the questions 10, 15, 20 years down the line, what you know about it now and what you need to set up to help that. I mean, there are some very good examples where that's not the case. But I think it's an important issue. And the other one that's an important issue, which has bothered me for years now, and it's the same theme, is we never measure the whole lifetime effects of energy use, of carbon intake or outtake of a project. It's classically the example with nuclear electricity generation, for example. I digress a little to make a point.
If sycamore is a non-native species of orchid, but actually is one of the species that grows very successfully, should we, it's a contradiction I guess, should we be planting sycamore and sycamore self-seeds very successfully here? Should we be discouraging that?
No, I don't think so. I said there is this debate about terminology and native and non-native, and I think that the term that my ecologist friends use for these in-between ones is archaeophytes, and I think they class sycamore and beech in there, for example. My answer is sycamores grow extremely well in exposed areas. I mean, I live in Musselburgh and sycamore is really good there. It seems like hell in my garden as well, but that's another point. I think we've learned the benefits of that tree. We're not blasting whole landscapes, whole hillsides, whole wetlands with these species. And if you drive around Orkney, you see these wonderful 3-story farmhouses surrounded by trees, and they're not all native trees. It's the real, I think, horse for course. And carry on with the sycamore.
Should we reintroduce the wolf to control the deer? Because you talked about fishing, where the landlord encouraged the complete shooting of the deer. It's a bit distasteful. And I've walked in Glenfishie and in Glenafric, where they fenced areas off, and you're a bit against fencing, but that allowed the regeneration of things like silver birch and mountain ash.
Okay, so first thing, I'm going to answer your question, but I would say I don't understand why we don't eat more venison. There's still a mentality problem in people's heads. It's a herbivore that doesn't get fed any stuff other than what it eats itself. Yeah? We don't seem to know how to cook it. I mean, my mother used to say, oh, it's terribly strong meat, and I served it for her one day without telling her what it was. I said, did you like it, Mum? Oh, it was lovely. What was it? And we tried it years ago when Safeways was still here. and it didn't appear on the shelves. But now I notice in my local Tesco's in Musselburgh, there's a whole variety of venison. So first thing is, I think there should be a much greater promotion of venison. There may be medics in the audience who say, well, it's red meat and all the rest of it, but it's tasty and it's there. And that would, I hope, be a spur. Second thing is, we need to change the way we value sporting estates. We value sporting estates still on the, so to speak, the catch of three species. The stag, preferably with as many points as possible, the salmon, and the grouse bag. Well, that's rubbish, in my view. We should be actually valuing these large estates on the basis of their, what I would call their natural capital. So what they actually deliver for society as a whole. Okay, what herbivores do we reintroduce? The popular one at the moment, before the wolf, is the lynx. And there's quite a lot of proponents in Scotland for the lynx. And they would be a very good predator. Probably on the roe deer. And roe deer are a major problem in our woodlands. And of course it's extremely difficult to shoot safely roe deer. Experts tell me that. What concerns me is that there are international protocols for looking at these things by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And we should go through those. What's the ecology first, and then what's the societal perspective on it? We did that for the beaver. It's still not popular in some places, but I think we should be doing that purposefully for the lynx, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be doing it for the wolf. Because those people at the moment who are proposing reintroducing the wolf, like Paul Lister in Easter Ross, he's going to have to put a big fence around his land, which doesn't make any sense. We know there are problems of wolf packs growing, and then they spread, or because the carrying capacity of that land is not enough. And there have been all sorts of issues in places like Slovenia, Slovakia, and even in France and Spain. But there's lots of good examples now of how to manage these situations. I mean, lynx in Spain is now a major, I think, progressive project of how to manage the animal in that environment. So I don't see why we shouldn't be properly looking at it with using the international protocols. And but my final point is, and I alluded to it, we have the Deer Scotland Act, and it has a section in it. It's all based on the voluntary principle, all good chaps together, you know? And it doesn't work, because it's a voluntary thing through the deer management groups. There is a section which are control orders, but they're never used. I mean, in my SNH days, we tried that, and it was very, very unpopular, and the government even swerves back from it. And I don't see why, if there is proven damage to the habitat, and we've got plenty of evidence of that around the country now, why they aren't brought in. I'm comfortable with the bringing together of the Deer Commission and what the Scottish Natural Heritage into one body. I think there are two entirely different disciplines. We fought it off, Magnuson and myself, in our day. I think the government needs to grasp hold of this, come up with some new legislation, decide what it wants to achieve, and actually work something out with the Association of Deer Management Groups. So I hope that's answered your question, because there's so many other dimensions to it.
Yeah. Okay, I think I can take one more question and then we'll need to bring it to a close.
A bit more of a statement. It's the economic side of it. And we've been in Murray, the amount of acreage that is planted coniferous to then be felled, to take down the road, to then burn biomass doesn't seem to make sense. And I also know that there's been such a shortage of timber that we're actually importing from China, and it just seems all mixed up. And trying to address climate change by doing these practices doesn't quite add up. It's not helping. So again, it's another arm of it, and I think you're right. The discussion needs to just keep on going with all these aspects and get the right people around the table, including the politicians, that are willing to actually go through with the legal side of it. And if people are not doing what they should be doing and changing practices, I've just been opened up your presentation, because I did forestry my first year, and I can recognise all the practices that you're saying about the foresters. And at that time it was, yes, this is a good thing, and now I'm saying, oh, I was really quite embarrassed to get a good mark in that. And yeah, it's great. So thank you very much for that talk, and let's all keep on talking.
Well, tonight wasn't only thought-provoking, there's some other contentious points being raised, so I'm sure you guys will all have a pint together and sort the world out. Roger, seriously, thank you very, very much for that talk. And yeah, indeed, there's a whole heap of stuff that I remember getting taught in geography and everything, and it's certainly started to turn from Rob upside. He's joined up thinking that isn't there, and there's something not joined up yet. Anyway, a little bit of festival housekeeping. Consider joining us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we're in the penultimate day of the 2022 festival. But we keep our social media up to date, so you can get a chance to see what's going on, all the time in the background and what's going to happen next year. So please consider subscribing to these. So just once again, Roger, thanks very much to you. And can I also thank the support team and the cinema team here, because they work just seamlessly in the background and they enable this event to be brought to you. So thank you very much to everyone.